3, 2, 1.
All right.
That was the best clap.
That was a very good clap. Good job. It's because we're also musically talented at this table.
Chris would quite disagree with you because I don't have an ounce of music.
I was
ability.
like, I'm not really musically talented.
I try.
Maybe a little bit.
But yeah, he's always pointing that out.
You can't hold the stoic face the whole time.
Michaela lasted 20 seconds before breaking on camera.
I've just accepted it. I love to worship, but
She's
nobody
great
wants
at
to
it.
hear me sing. So I try not to sing at all when he's like near me, because
But
or if it's loud enough.
But you worship
if it's
so
loud
well.
enough. Yeah. If it's loud enough, then it doesn't really matter. But no.
But really, worship is all about faith at the end of the day.
It is an expression of our faith.
It's an expression of our faith, yeah. And that's what we're talking about today. We do have a very special guest. We're joined to my left by Michaela. If you missed one of our earlier episodes in our overall series, we are married. So I have my best friend next to me. And yeah, we got to talk about faith together today. I know one of the things right before we started recording that we were talking about is maybe starting with just like a high level question or concept of like, what is the relationship between our role in our faith? Because faith is, it's going to take us way more than 2 hours, but we're going to give it a good shot to break down like the concept of faith. And one of those pieces is we have faith that is a gift from God, and we also have a role in building up our own faith and each other's faith. And I think where we probably should start is where our faith originates, right? I don't think none of us decided to invent our own faith. It was a gift first and foremost from the Holy Spirit, right?
That's good.
And so I think I want to start there of like how I'm trying to formulate a question on the fly. So if anybody else has anything, feel free to jump in.
I think when you said that, I was thinking about this idea of how we get to exercise our faith in prayer and what that looks like. Like we have a void of needing our Creator to be part of our life, but how does that lived out practically in faith building exercises that we get to do when we go to the Father in prayer and we either have unanswered prayer for quite a long time or the answer is no. How does that play into our faith as believing in the God who is our Creator and believing that He is who He says He is, even when it doesn't feel like it?
Yeah. Maybe we can start. I have a good question now. Thank you, Suzy. Suzy took my role earlier this morning, so she has some extra empathy for me.
Yes.
I think where we can start is just like, what does the word faith mean to each of you? When you hear that, like, what are synonyms or what is the first thing that pops into your mind when you're like, what is faith to you?
Belief. It's trust.
It's good.
It's peace.
This is going to sound really, but what comes to mind, which is really because back to the trust, I just got this picture of falling. Like faith is falling and believing that our Father's going to catch us.
Like a trust
but
fall.
Not having any idea of what that's going to look like, but just falling.
Wow, that's beautiful.
Yeah, I was I was tentative to say just because it's almost exactly Chris's.
But now that Suzy said that, you can feel free to share.
Because there's been some gap between repetitive answer. No, I've really been caught up in this phrase that I've heard recently of just taking God at his word. And that really, that's faith. That's belief and trust. And when I think of it as taking God at his word, it puts it more in the human perspective for me, because when you're like, oh, just have faith, is like, well, what the heck does that mean at all practically, on a practical step? But there's so many things right now where it's just take God at his word. Do you believe that he said that? Do you believe that he is good to you, like that good to you? And walk like you believe it. Yeah.
It's like when in the Old Testament, God asked Abraham to take Isaac up the mountain and sacrifice him to the Lord, which is a horrible, awful thing for God to ask of a father, right? And add to that Isaac was the answer to God's promise to Abraham for a couple of decades, I think it was. I mean, a long time, right? Actually, I think it was even longer than that.
Yeah, Isaac is like the personification of Abraham's faith from like the previous few months or years, right? Yeah.
And so here is this son that's supposed to be the fulfillment of God's promise that Abraham's children, his bloodline, would become like the number of the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, which of course we know today, looking backwards, we have 20/20 vision to see what God was foreshadowing was that through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, all those that would follow Jesus would be a part of Abraham's bloodline. This is kind of how all that was said very shortly. So God calls Abraham to go up this mountain and take his son, and they're hiking, right? Like they're hiking up this mountain, and at one point, Isaac says to Abraham, "Dad, we have the wood, we have the fire, but I know how this works. Where's the sacrifice?" Right? And Abraham doesn't say, "You're it, buddy."
No.
He says, "The Lord will provide."
Yeah. And
what a beautiful statement of faith that was, that for Abraham to say, looking back at my life, there was 100 years before Isaac was born that God, I've walked with God now most of my adult life, and he's asked me to do some things that didn't make sense, and I did them, and he came through for me. And now he's asked me to do this thing, to go up this mountain and sacrifice the one who is supposed to be the fulfillment of his promise to me. And what faith looks like practically is walking up that mountain, believing that God will provide the sacrifice, that there's a twist in the story that better aligns with the character of God, because the character of God is not one to ask a father to sacrifice his son, yet he sacrificed his son for us, his unique son Jesus for us. And the struggle I often have is I read stories like Abraham's, I read stories like Gideon's. Gideon was literally hiding in a hole in the ground because of the enemies of Israel that had attacked them. And God said, "Oh, come on, you're going to lead an army and have this great victory." And God gives him an army of something like 30,000 men, which probably, like, you might feel okay about that. And then God whittled it all the way down to the hundreds. And then sent him out, right? And it makes no sense. The children of Israel, when they took Jericho, they marched around the city and sang for 7 days. I mean, that's an idiotic battle plan, right? It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
But faith is when God speaks, you do the thing he asks you to do, trusting he has the outcome in hand. But I often look at that and go, yeah, but they're like literally the heroes of our faith. They're like superheroes.
They're in the Bible.
Yeah. I'm not in the Bible. I'll never be in the Bible. So how do I do what they did? I don't have the spiritual muscles they had.
Yeah.
But the reality is they got the same spiritual muscles that any of us have.
Yeah, I mean, when you say that, I feel like people could say that about us in church planning. like, y'all are crazy
We
to
are.
even embark on this.
It's true.
And, you look back and, the simple, like Noah, like people must have thought he was insane building this boat for so long, and just even the mass size of it,
Hundreds of miles from an ocean, and they'd never once seen rain at that point in the history of the world.
Yeah. And so,
Do you think it's always, and I kind of know the answer, but would love to hear your own stories or examples. Like, is it always the crazy thing that makes no sense to humans? Is that what faith is? Or are there examples you can think of where God asked you to do something, but it also like kind of made sense and like aligned? Because I think sometimes we can overemphasize, like, it's only the only time that I know it's God speaking to me is if it goes against every fiber of my being and all
So
wisdom
uncomfortable,
of
yeah.
humans. And I think sometimes it's easy to put God's voice into that category alone and not like, well, if it makes sense, that's not from God. Like, it has
Right.
to be crazy and not make sense for
Yeah.
it to be God speaking, or for it to be faith.
yeah.
And I think even thinking of the person you're speaking to, a lot of times we would hear it with young adults that are like, I don't want to submit this to God because I'm worried that he will just be like, no spouse for you or something, where they're just like, because that's completely not what I want. They have a heart to be in a meaningful relationship, to be married, to have a family, and they're like, I don't know if I'm ready to submit this to God, because like,
Yeah.
if he says no, and like, and usually it's them saying like, he will certainly like say no.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of speaking to that person as well, in that question that you asked.
Yeah. Well, are there examples in any of your lives where you're like, God asked, I felt like this was from God, but if I told my neighbor, they'd be like, yeah, that's a cool decision, or like, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, as cliche as it might sound, marrying Suzy was, something that I really wanted to do, and was very clearly for me the will of God. I mean, that was pretty easy, pretty quick. I mean, we knew probably within the first week, 10 days that we were dating, that we'd get married and spend the rest of our lives together. And
It went nothing like we thought it would go.
no, it's definitely not gone the way we thought.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah. But even like, I had a desire to work in vocational ministry from the time I was a teenager. And I was, in my 40s before that became a reality for me. So when the time came, the way that God spoke in that process was a little bit cryptic and unique. He started with simply speaking to me during a sermon saying, quit your job. And that sort of began this refreshed process of discernment, further prayer, conversations with Suzy and friends and mentors who, trusted advisors in my life who prayed with me and talked with me to work through it. And I love that you make that distinction, because we do talk about a lot those extreme cases, and we don't often talk about how God will use our experience and our intuition and our logic and people in our lives to help us work through even the things that feel pretty obvious. And I think it is important to say that, because there are some people out there that don't have this crazy miraculous story, even for how they became a church planner. I was like, no, I just always wanted to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think when you think of even people's testimonies, or, I think of like the women in my life and talking to them, even the young adults, where they're like, oh, well, my prayer request isn't like, I don't have cancer. I don't have like, the thing that I'm asking God for is small. And I think the same thing with faith, if it's a small faith decision that's not as extravagant as somebody else's, we tend to lessen the faith that it took for that to happen. And so I always try to encourage people, with your story is your story, and it is not any less important than anyone else's story. the faith journey that God took you on, it may seem insignificant, but it is very significant to God. And it's very significant to the impact that you have on others watching you live out your faith. You may think it's small, but it could be instrumental in someone knowing who God is. Mm-hmm. And so don't put it into this less significant category because it's not as big or grand as somebody else's.
Right.
I even think of like my sister, who I am sitting in this chair today in large part because my sister and her husband invited me to church when I was a teenager. And when they first started going to church, they began to invite family and friends to just go with them and explore faith. And I said no for months, but the invitation kept coming. And it wasn't like pressure. It was like, hey, we have this coming up. I thought you might enjoy it. Nah, I'm good. Well, and then 3 weeks later, we have this coming up. And finally, one day, I was just ready, and I said yes to, going with them. And here I am today as a result of them having the faith to just be persistent and simply offering an invitation to me.
Yeah, so far I think we've only really touched on one angle of faith.
Yeah.
And I think the common thread that I'm hearing, which is awesome, that's one of the things that comes to my mind, is like hearing God's voice almost with decisions, right? That's kind of what we've been talking about so far. That's just one aspect. Like what else comes to mind? Because like even just in my own head can rattle off, like faith can also just be, when you mentioned taking God at his word, some of it's not making a decision. Some of it is just letting the word of God like change you and change your thoughts or your mindset on a certain situation. Like what else comes to mind when you think of faith besides like, should I move? Should I? Because that is where you need to have faith of like, is this what's happening in the world? Is it just me? Like one of the things in our one discussion group with our small group at young adults was like these big questions. And I was like, I feel like what you're asking is like, do my choices matter? Is God real? Is God good? And is he in control? Mm-hmm. And I think that as I'm thinking out loud, I think that's part of what all the different pieces of faith are. And I think what we've been talking about so far is just that last question of like, do my choices matter? Mm-hmm. And that impacts like, how do I make choices? But I think the first three are like critical questions to ask yourself about God that influence the way that you see the world, and that you see other people, and that you see the situations that you're in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually was just having a conversation with my mom about this before this, of just how do you start to see the world as like through the eyes of somebody that's a citizen of the kingdom of heaven? How do you start that process? Because there's some people where they look at it and it's like, I want to get to there, but I don't know how. And this conversation that we were having was just circling around taking God at his word, starting from your place of identity and having faith in what he says. And then trusting that you don't, like you said, it's kind of the free fall where it's like, yeah, I don't know if I will have the outcome that I want. I don't know for certain. But taking it with just a step of trusting what God says over us as born again believers and what our identity is as a citizen of heaven, taking him at his word in that. And as we take steps of obedience, of trusting that, it does help to renew our minds. It does help to start taking us in this way that when we look at the kingdom, or when we look at the world, we can see it through a kingdom perspective. We can see it through, just seeing it differently. And I think that's kind of been it sounds really simple of just like, oh yeah, just like believe what God says about you is hard. It does
Really
not
hard.
feel true
Yeah.
most of the time. And I think
Yeah.
that is something that, again, we're talking about a lot of our experience with working with young adults. A lot of times we have, and just as humans, we want to go off of what we feel.
Mm-hmm.
And it is really hard to start going off of just what's said about you. And just
Do you have any like
Yeah.
small recent examples of like what people were struggling with believing specifically of who God says they are?
Oh, I'm really terrible at remembering.
Well, I was going to share something when you were talking
Yeah.
about this childlike faith that it just reminded me of a conversation we just had with Hanali, and she was sharing how they were really tired one night, and they were going out to dinner, and they were really frustrated by their waiter, and Hanali and Rich were just like going back and forth on how this waiter was just not giving them good service. And Alea, their daughter, who is 11, said, "He is a child of God too." Mic drop.
Oh, man.
And I think that, going into what you're talking about, like,
She's so wise. Why isn't she on the podcast?
She asked today. She will be.
And I just love that because,
Yeah.
one, because that our children are, our influences, the influence that you guys have on YAs speaks louder with your actions than our words, right? And so when you live out your faith, it comes back to you, like through this childlike faith where Alea's like, don't forget, Mom and Dad, that person is a child of God. And I think that our Heavenly Father is saying that to us, like, don't forget, you're my beloved child.
Yeah.
Do you know where my journal landed last night when we came home?
Possibly.
Could one of you guys, super producers, grab that for me?
I think it's in my black purse in our bedroom.
I just feel
It's a brown journal.
compelled to actually read
In the
something
bedroom.
that I wrote during our 24-hour prayer session. So a couple of months ago, we were feeling a little bit stuck on some things, right? So we held that 24-hour prayer session actually in this room. And it's just in the beginning of the night, I sat down and I just asked God, if you could say one thing to me tonight, what would you want to say? And I just started writing what I felt like He gave me. Thanks, Abs. And he brought me back to this last night during a prayer session that we went to, and it seems appropriate for this conversation. And I was going to try to just sort of quote, hit the high points, but I'm just going to read the whole thing because I think it revolves all around. And it's just, so I asked him, what would you want to say to me specifically? Chris, you are loved. You are loved whether Presence Church is considered a success or not. I have a plan you can't imagine, so just hang on tight. Keep doing the work, but stay close. Give me room to work and do my part. I'll provide for you. I'll provide for my church. I love the Bay Area, and I haven't given up on it. Stay the course, no matter how difficult it might get. Don't lose heart. The adventure is just beginning. And, just a couple of days before recording this podcast, we got the difficult news of a no to a partnership that we were really, really praying hard for. It was a 6-figure partnership with the Church Planting Network. And we felt great about all of our meetings with them and our trip out to visit them. And the morning of that video call, I slid out of bed and I knelt beside the bed and I just prayed. And I felt like the Holy Spirit just gently reminded me that this is His thing. This is God's thing, and we're here to steward it. And so He's going to fund it however He wants to fund it. So whatever is the outcome of today's conversation was really irrelevant. Jesus is going to fund Presence Church, and He's going to take care of our family however He chooses to. And to me, that was a beautiful reminder for me that I needed. And when I got it, I was like, oh, that feels like not good news later. I feel like God's preparing me.
It's kind of like, no matter what, I
Yeah.
love you.
Yeah,
And then it's just like,
wait, why?
Yeah.
Why?
Yes. Yeah.
But I needed to hear it.
Yeah.
And that deposit of faith, which I believe was God making a deposit in me to build my faith, was what I needed to respond in a mature and gracious way when they shared with me the news. And to be honest, great group of people, and they have to choose from between 30 and 45 applicants every year, and they only get to pick 8. And so I have to trust the very successful church and church planting network that they do a great job of listening to the voice of God and discerning well. And so if I can trust that they're hearing from God, and I do, then I can trust that God is going to take care of us in another way. And so that was really something that God did for me to build my faith for even a difficult day. It was a very emotional day. But I felt joy. I felt relief and release, in spite of not getting the answer I wanted. And I felt the sense. So it's this weird like dynamic where, I don't know, maybe it's a paradox even, where like God makes this deposit in me to increase my faith, and then that faith repays me in some way. Like, he builds my faith in a way that I need it. And then I get to return that back to him in faith, right?
Yeah, and I think as we were processing through that, and God was speaking to me and just really trying to figure out, what does this look like, this faith journey? I mean, church planting, definitely the last few years, even before church planting, has been faith building exercises for us. But this is to a different degree of, when you don't get the answer that you want, will you still trust me? Will you still take me at my word? And God, was calling us to celebrate the no. And I don't know if y'all have ever celebrated a no before of this magnitude.
Does it hit
odd.
weird?
It was so interesting. I thought it would be hard. I thought it would be different. I just knew he wanted us to do it, but you don't know like exactly why or how to do it. But for me, I just felt like this impression from God that he was challenging us to celebrate the same way we would have celebrated as if we received the gift that we were praying for. And so we did. We went out to a nice dinner, and we had drinks, and we toasted and celebrated having the faith of the unknown of what the miracle is that he's got in store for us in the no answer.
Right.
Yeah, we literally toasted to the unknown miracle that's on its way.
I feel like we had a slightly, like, a different story. But I think there's a lot of parallels when we had decided to stay like in San Jose long term. In that season we were both like, man, it'd be awesome to own a house somewhere. For most people, usually the way you do that is you leave San Jose. That's
Step
like
one.
That's
Step
it.
one. Don't be
for most people. And so like,
Good job, promotion, and sleeves.
so we were looking outside back then of California, and at one point I think you had started getting some glimmer of like, I hope God doesn't call us to stay here. That would be really hard.
I would not like that.
I would not like that. Yeah.
Please
And
no.
I think we.
It's like kneeling beside the bed where you know it's coming.
Yes, almost. Very similar.
When I first got
Just brace for it.
I think I mentioned this when we told our story on a much
Maybe,
earlier podcast. But I started by hearing the voice that said, what if I call you to stay? And I was rebuking it. So that kind of tells you my attitude like that I was starting with.
And how your faith changes, like when we get to the end of the
yes.
story, and how God can change your heart. But I think for us, what changed was shifting the thing we were asking for. Like that's how God worked on our faith in that season, because we said like, you know, let's give it 2 years, let's stay in California, but just for 2 years, then we'll reevaluate, which I think a lot of people do that as well. And we came up on the time limit, and we prayed and fasted, and we both arrived at like, no, I think we're supposed to stay here. But in that moment, it was like this, what you guys are saying, this beautiful like excitement and joy at what God was going to do. There was also a little bit of mourning, like we had to lay down this priority that we had in our lives before then of like own a home, like pretty close to number one. We had to move that way down the totem pole for a greater purpose that we, and I think this is going to shift gears, so I want to make sure that you, because I was going to talk about Echo's role in kind of community and building up our faith to even consider that decision. But if you want to add anything else from that, your memory of that time or that process.
Yeah, I would say that like a lot of things, I think that we fight kind of two battles, and sometimes we can fight it multiple times. There's one to get free of something, and then there's a fight to stay free. And I think for us, that was the first time that it was like, okay, we are free. We are saying, Jesus, you're king. We're going to prioritize your mission in our lives. We're going to stay here. We respect your call, and we receive it. And there was so many times after that where we were still kind of like, maybe we'll look for like renting a house. And God was like, no.
Well, that was
we're not ready.
Like immediately after, very close to that time when we decided to stay. And then we're like, oh, maybe we'll apply to rent a house. And like we got the answer that it was a no. And like on the drive home, one of the few moments in my life that I like tangibly experienced like the presence of God like in our car. I was the one driving, which is not ideal.
Let me set the scene for you. You'll want to hear this too. So basically, we're driving,
and I'm very emotional. If you know me,
so
all
Mark,
the time.
The most stoic. Mark's the most stoic. I'm the one that's usually emoting the most, and so he's driving, and then it gets quiet, and there's a worship song, and then Mark just starts, just like, I don't know, making these choking noises,
like bawling,
like
just but I don't ugly cry.
Yes,
this is trying to hold in.
Yes.
I don't know he's crying. Right. I just hear.
You thought he was having a seizure?
I was trying to be able to talk.
We are not safe. But no,
well,
and then I was like, good or bad? Just tell me good or bad. Like, good, thumbs up, thumbs down. You okay? You not okay?
Well, and I think the song was worthy of it all. And what you guys were talking about is what reminded me of this whole season and story, where I remember, like, I wasn't sad that we didn't get the house. And I remember like working through in the car, like, why am I not sad? Like, I'm almost happy. Like, why? This is so weird. And then that song came on, and it was like God answered me. He was like, it's because you gave this thing up, like, to get more of me. And that's worth it every time. And there's no replacement for it. So that's why you're not sad, is you're on this, your faith is in a place that it's never been before, like new heights, and it's therefore everything else like can't bring me down and like can't. It was so bizarre because what you said, I expected it to feel like so frustrating, so disappointing, I'm so sad, and like none of those emotions were there.
Yeah, kind of like the word that I'm thinking of is almost a supernatural resilience.
Yeah, and peace with the decision.
Which is what peace often is. It feels like. Yeah. And Yeah, so I think that we fought a couple different battles afterwards of staying free, of realigning, and having those little adjustments, kind of chiropractic adjustments of like, no, remember, you're stay in alignment, keep your priorities aligned, and that the posture of your heart matters, and what you prioritize matters to God.
I think there's something really powerful in the Psalms where it's I'm going to murder the paraphrase of it, but essentially following God, he'll give you the desires of your heart. But you can read that a couple different ways. What does it mean? Does it mean he's going to give me the Ferrari that I want? Or does it mean he's going to change my desires to give me desires that align with his? And I think you could say there are seasons where both can be true, but in like what you guys just described, and even in this church planting journey and a number of other ways in our lives, we received a no. We wanted desperately to serve in marriage ministry for a long time. And 3 times we applied to do it with the same organization. Once we got a wait, the second time we got a no, and the third time we were invited to apply again, so we did. And they accepted us onto the team, but we had to raise our own financial support. And we just weren't able to raise enough money, consistent contributions to do it, and we had to withdraw. We went to dinner. We grieve with food. We celebrate with food. We do everything with food. We went to one of our favorite spots at the time, and I distinctly remember backing into the parking space, and we were looking at the restaurant, and we sat in silence for like 45 minutes and just cried. And we drove home. We never got out of the car.
Wow. It was so hard. It was so hard.
We had invested a lot of emotional energy and relational capital was spent in asking people to give to support us, and we weren't able. It was very difficult. Because we knew that was the end of that. The possibility of that, at least in that form. And you see, you reach these seasons where it's like we have to release something that we felt like was a desire, that was a good desire. Owning a home, we have a similar story. Wanting to own a home.
What we like to say is, well, Lord Jesus, we'll have a mansion over the hilltop, because it's not going to be on this side, because we can't afford the little crumb over here of the little shack in the Bay Area.
But I feel like that's where like you can track the Apostle Peter's life. He has these several moments that are recorded in the New Testament that are these big faith steps forward, these big leaps forward in his relationship with Jesus. He gets out of the boat on the seashore after he catches a bunch of fish, and he follows Jesus. And then, later he does the walk on water thing. And then after that, he denies Jesus. But then he decides, okay, I am really going to follow Jesus. And then the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit comes, and Peter's the one that steps forward and preaches this incredible sermon, and thousands of people believe, and the church really begins in earnest. So you can track these big faith steps in his life where, if I'm in his shoes, I'm thinking, I think I got this Jesus thing pretty figured out. And then the moment comes, you're like, I don't know anything. I'm so lost in all this, right? Because there's always another layer of depth and perspective change. And we begin to release things like owning a home or choosing what kind of ministry we work in, and allow God to give us the desires of our heart that align with his. And that's where we find the greatest peace and the greatest faith and the greatest trust and the greatest fulfillment in life.
What do you think is the relationship with like hard seasons and easy seasons with faith? Because do you think that you only get more faith through hard seasons? I don't know if I would say that's true, but I think they're different. They have different purposes almost.
Yeah. I don't think so. I do think I don't know. For me, thinking back on all the different faith-building exercises, if you will, that God has put us through, I think as hard as they have been through significant losses in our family, through significant struggles and challenges, what makes it easier or harder, or I think, is our proximity to Jesus, our intimacy. As we have grown in our faith, as we lean on him more, it has to make sense less. Because I know early on in my faith, I was constantly looking for answers of why did this happen?
Yeah.
Of I can't believe this happened. God, like, are you still who you say you are? Are you still good? Now I can honestly say, like, when I have those moments, going back to his word and going, yes, I believe he is who he says he is. Even when I'm shaken, my foundation is there and I can lean into him broken and it hurting and in significant pain, but still knowing that he is a good God. And I think for me, that's the difference in my faith journey. I don't have to understand it, whether he's given me that confirmation or has given me confirmation through other people of what this next faith step is. In this season, I've just been really thankful that as I grow closer in proximity to him, these things get easier, even when they're catastrophic in pain.
Yeah, the day after we got the news of the no from that church planting network, I was driving down the highway and
well, before that, when the night that we got that news, we celebrated, we were coming home, there was a song that came on the radio. I can't remember. Do you remember what the song was?
I don't.
It was a song.
As the song.
It was a song that we hadn't really heard before, but
It was a new song, yeah.
But it was a song about, like,
Sing it for us.
not a chance, not a chance.
I don't even remember
but
what
about,
the song was.
like, surrendering. And at the exact same time, Chris and I both in the car went like this. We're open, God, to whatever you want.
Yeah.
And we just started laughing
Hysterically,
hysterically because we were like,
We're both
this is
receiving
ridiculous,
it.
you
Yeah.
know, that we're both just like,
But so often the physical represents the position, your physical position represents the position of your heart. And so the next day, it was a song again, came on, and it was, gosh, I can't remember the name of the song. Was it My King Forever? It's the one with the line that says, we lift our hands up and we lay ourselves down. We lay our
super
whole
producer, do you know
lives
what song that is?
down.
King Forever by Josh Baldwin.
There you go.
My King Forever by Josh Baldwin. We lift our hands up.
Wow.
We lay our whole lives down. We lay our whole lives down before you. And I started cracking up laughing because I'm like, we sing these songs all the time in church and we sing them driving down the highway. How often do we really live the lyrics? To say that even when there's $100,000 no for this thing that we're desperate for this church plant to work because we believe Jesus has called us to it.
Because we believe our desires are his desires.
We believe our desires are aligned with his. Like, we think all the things are in the right place, and that is the pathway that makes the most sense to me to see this thing, take another step forward. And so, am I willing to lift my hands up in worship to him and to lay my whole life down? And he does it a different way than what I expect. And we think a lot about Ephesians 3:20. We talk about it a lot. God can do infinitely more than we could ever ask, think, or imagine. But we don't like it when his infinitely more starts with the no for what we want.
Yeah. I mean, I think Rich's line, which he actually got from an entrepreneur that he used to work with, was following somebody whose dream is bigger than your dream has a big difference on their ability to lead you. And what we were talking about is, like, that's actually a beautiful metaphor for Jesus, because his dream for your life and his kingdom is always more
Yeah.
than the dream that you think is like number one, or will make you happy, or will make Presence Church Plant super successful on our timeline, right? Or fully funded, all these different things.
Yeah.
It's such a great reminder of like whose dream is bigger and, you know, will be fulfilled.
And who knows better too,
Yeah.
right? So Isaiah tells us that God's ways are higher than ours. His thoughts are higher than ours. And, you know, we just talked about Ephesians 3. And so faith to me lived out is lived out in the question, how am I going to answer this question? Can I trust that he's working things out even when I don't understand it, when it doesn't make sense to me, and frankly, when I don't like it and it stresses me out?
Yeah.
Because, you know, had that funding come through for us, we would have been fully funded for year one of the church plant.
Wow.
Which would have taken a lot of pressure off for trying to make things happen. But that's trying to make things happen in the way that we want to make them happen. And I don't think the way that we all want to make them happen is inherently wrong, but we have to plan the best we can, but have open hands to allow the Spirit of God to move however he chooses to move. And we have to be okay when he goes left and we want to go right. Then we need to surrender and go left. And I think releasing that, my own pride and my own sense of, it's a false sense of security in my own plan, I have to be willing to release that and still stick with God and not get mad and quit. Right? To stick with him and trust that his way is higher than mine.
Yeah, I think that dynamic of like flexing that muscle of faith and building up a muscle of faith is a great cliffhanger for us to land on for this week. I think we'll talk a lot more about that concept next week. So make sure you tune back in for part 2 next week, talking about faith. But thank you all for this part 1 conversation on making decisions and how that we change our priorities and surrender our desires for a better one from God. It's a really, really great conversation. So we'll catch you all next week.
Awesome.